A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth, read by Sarah D.
Chapter 6. The next day I visited the agency Maureen had directed me to. It meant another train journey, but it would be worth it if I could get a job in Red Hill or somewhere near the Bartletts. I left early so as to avoid an encounter with Mrs. Reed. It had been colder than ever in the night, and I was wearing some rather scuffed-looking fur boots, which I had discovered at the back of my wardrobe. In spite of the late hour at which I had arrived back the night before, I had felt too excited to sleep, so had spent the best part of 2 hours packing up my things in readiness to leave when I decided where I was going. Now I stumped along Victoria Station, noticing happily that my surroundings had an already familiar aspect. This new adaptability in myself was something I had noticed only recently. It pleased me because it made life more comfortable, although at the back of my mind a horror of change still lurked. The agency wasn't difficult to find. When I left by the little back stairs to come into the high street again, I was tingling with a sense of well-being. Everything was arranged. Maureen's friend had sorted out a job as mother's help with a very nice family. They had 2 children, a girl of 4 and a baby of 18 months. "Do you like children?" "Oh, yes," I had agreed swiftly. The agent had rung Mrs. Muir and made me an appointment with her that afternoon. It only remained for me to present myself with the reference Maureen had given me and make a good impression. I looked down at my scuffed boots and my spirits dropped a little. My coat was slightly grubby too, and it had shrunk out of shape at the back, which gave me rather an odd profile. I glared at the shop window, which had pointed out these things, then gave a brief laugh. I was too happy to let little things upset me. After a big lunch in a milk bar, I caught the bus to the address in Hawley which the agent had given me. The Muirs house was large and rambling, at the end of a neglected driveway. I looked at the heavy knocker with some apprehension before raising it. The door was opened by a young woman in a tight wool frock, who held out her hand to me in a straightforward manner. "Miss Clouston, come in. We're not terribly tidy yet, I'm afraid. We only moved in a few days ago, and I expect you know what that means." I followed her into the front room, where a fire was burning fitfully in the grate. "I suppose the agent has told you what I required in the way of a girl? We send the heavy washing out to the laundry, so there's just the household chores, plus a bit of help with the children. No cooking, except perhaps if you could manage the breakfast now and then. We've got an aga, which we stoke up to last right through till morning." She looked at me. "What do you think? Does it sound as if it would suit you?" She read my letter of reference through with a slightly over-casual air and said brightly, "Yes, that seems all right. I don't know what you expected in the way of wages, though. I'm afraid we're not in a position to pay you very much at present. What I had in mind was somewhere about £2.5. I assured her this would suit me very well, and she led me out to show me briefly over the house. "I don't think it's a bad house to keep clean. It's smaller than what we're used to, out in the country, and you see we've had the kitchen renovated. That really wasn't a mess. This is the children's playroom. I don't expect you to keep this very tidy." She gave a low chuckle. "Wazzy, this is Miss Clouston." "Diana," I interrupted quickly. "Well, Diana then, if you don't mind. This is Wendelin. We call her Wazzy, I'm afraid. And baby John is sleeping in his pram." I moved in the following day. Leaving Cadogan Square had given me a fresh feeling of elation. For the first time I understood the cliché, "on the crest of a wave." I was riding the biggest wave imaginable, and where it would deposit me was one of the mysteries I required no answer to at the time. I had paid Mrs. Reed my rent up to date, and found I could still afford a taxi to the train with my 2 cases. With the memory of the shabby little room behind me, I seemed to have discarded the atmosphere of perilous security and doubt of my own sanity. Everything ahead of me was homely, safe, and comfortable as Mrs. Muir's freckled face. I was determined that from now on I would enjoy life for its own sake and not examine it too closely or brood on my memories of Mickold. I had been given a new identity. I would enjoy it in my own way. At least half of my well-being could, I suppose, have been put down to the taxi I was relaxing in. This was a luxury for me, and at the end of the trip I tipped the driver rather furtively, hobbling away with my cases. The room I was given at Top Lodge, as the house was called, was large and draughty, with bare skirting boards and very little furniture. However, a big, soft, eider-downed bed commanded the centre of one wall, and there was ample wardrobe space for my few clothes. Mrs. Muir left me to unpack, while she went to fetch Waz home from the nearby day school. I arranged my clothes and possessions in the drawers, with a warm glow of pleasure at my own tidiness. I had just pushed the cases under the bed when, through the window, I saw Mrs. Muir returning with Gwendolen in a small maroon school uniform. That night I had dinner with Mrs. Muir and her husband in the lounge. She had said to me earlier, "Normally you can have high tea with the children, and then we'll leave you dinner in the oven so you can help yourself later on. But tonight, as Mr. Muir would like to see you, we thought you could have it with us." She seemed faintly embarrassed, and all I could do was look embarrassed in return. It didn't occur to me to thank her. But as we sat in front of the fire, helping ourselves from a tea wagon to macaroni cheese and fish pie, I felt myself responding willingly to their polite cross-examination of me. Mr. Muir was a big, ginger-moustached man with a rather affected voice. He was fond of making puns, then looking exaggeratedly shamefaced. Mrs. Muir tried to keep the conversation serious, and soon I began to feel, with some amusement, that she thought of me as ever so slightly dumb. In reply to a question about my parents, I suddenly surprised both of us by saying, "Well, my father's a doctor of philosophy. He's in America on his sabbatical leave at the moment, with my mother. They're coming to England sometime soon, though." There was a startled silence. Then Mrs. Muir said, "Oh, and are you interested in philosophy too?" "No, I don't understand much about it. I tried to read Daddy's books when I was too young, and I think it put me off." We returned to talk of other things, but later on Mrs. Muir said suddenly, "What made you think of taking on a job like this?" "I don't know," I smiled at her. "I suppose I thought it would be a change. And then I liked the idea of a live-in job." "Well, I hope you don't tire of it in too much of a hurry. Most of your evenings will be your own, except when we want to go out." She was looking vaguely worried. "Perhaps Diana would like a glass of sherry with us," said Mr. Muir. The rest of the week passed swiftly enough, and I found myself enjoying the routine life in this family atmosphere. Mr. Muir knocked on my door early each morning to wake me, and I would doze for a few minutes more before bouncing out of bed and dressing frantically on the cold linoleum in front of the dressing table. I would arrive downstairs with crooked lipstick and tying my white apron, which was too big for me and had to be tucked in the middle. Before long, warm coffee fumes would steam up around my eyes, always the coldest part of me, and thaw them back into focus. Gwendolen was the most difficult to please. "Mummy does the sausages in flour." "That will do, Wazzy," from Mrs. Muir. "Oh, you put Marmite. I said marmalade." "Well, give it to baby John," I would croak in my raw morning voice. As I swept and polished, I would keep one ear on the radio, which was very rarely switched off. The popular songs surprised and often bewildered me. Those I had been used to were far more intelligible, but curiously monotonous. I soon found myself humming over the sink. As Mrs. Muir had promised, most of my evenings after 6 were free. I would clear the children's tea, which I gave them at 4 o'clock. Then we would sit in the warm lounge, reading stories by a table lamp. Before 6, Mrs. Muir would help me bath them, and after that my time was my own. It was cold sitting up in my room, but sometimes I would borrow the playroom heater and toast one leg at a time as I sprawled on the mat. I had joined the local library, one day out shopping with the children, and now had plenty to read. What had fascinated me was a book of poems by W.H. Auden. Mrs. Muir had looked rather surprised at my selection of books, and it wasn't till some time later that I discovered poetry wasn't read by the masses, as it was in Micold. I soon realized why. Poetry in Micold was much more everyday, readable matter. It was no more difficult to understand than prose on a slightly elevated level. And yet, as I let W.H. Auden creep into my sleepy 10 o'clock brain, I felt curiously moved, without fully understanding why. The strange thing was that it had a familiar flavour to it. Before long, I could have sworn I had known the existence of such poetry all my life. It was after a late night, reading this disturbing book, that I woke feeling restless for the first time since starting work. Mr. Muir was knocking firmly on my door, and he called out, "Better hurry if you're coming to Mass." I brightened immediately and remembered that Mrs. Muir had offered to prepare the breakfast while I went to church with Mr. Muir. "I'll go to the 11 o'clock Mass with the children," she had explained. Now I dressed quickly and followed Mr. Muir out to the station wagon, nibbling a banana in place of breakfast. He drove recklessly, and I was pleased to be able to relax in the dim, almost silent church. The service disappointed me, because I found I could understand so little of it. It was conducted in a language similar to one spoken in a country across the sea from Micold, but which I had never studied. This turned my mind to think of what countries existed beyond England, other than America and New Zealand. I had been lacking in knowledge of geography back in Micold. Here I would be considered almost moronically ignorant if I didn't find an atlas and study it thoroughly and soon. I made a note to borrow one from the library, and couldn't help smiling at the idea of what Mrs. Muir's expression might be. She thought my tastes odd enough as it was. But now people were getting up and leaving the church. Mr. Muir said to me quietly, "Go out to the car. I'll be there in a few minutes." I left the church, watching inquisitively as the shuffling file of people crossed themselves briefly with holy water. Sitting in the front seat of the station wagon, waiting for Mr. Muir, the mysterious odour and atmosphere of the church remained with me. It made me feel slightly uncomfortable and reminded me of my feeling of dread and claustrophobia, which had made me leave the church near Cadogan Square in such a hurry. I wondered, for the first time, if I really wanted to have anything to do with this religion. Its mysteriousness made me feel insecure. Mr. Muir returned, and we drove back in silence. That day we had a midday roast dinner in the dining room, with Mr. Muir making jokes and playing with Wendolen's feet under the table. "When am I having my birthday, Mummy?" she asked suddenly, picking up a square of Yorkshire pudding. "Put that down and use your fork, or you won't be having one." "Mark's coming to my party, isn't he? Who else is coming?" "Who would you like?" "Elena. Elena doesn't know we've got a new maid, does she?" "Waz, Diana isn't our maid. Now wait while I wipe your fingers. You are a messy girl. Look at baby John." "Well, you feed him. Anyway, he's usually worse than that. Throw your meat out, John." "I'll smack you, Wendolen." Wendolen squirmed down in her chair and pulled a face. I listened to this conversation with half an ear. Mrs. Muir had paid me the night before, and I was thinking of how I would spend the following evening, if the Muirs weren't planning to go out. She had said to me several times, "I believe there's a good film on in Hawley. Isn't there someone you could go with?" I had thought of Kathleen. I had thought of Josie. I had even thought of Stephen. It occurred to me that I should be doing something to keep in touch with these people. It would be a pity not to see Kathleen again. I felt as if I knew her quite well. Perhaps we had corresponded while I was in New Zealand. This reminded me of Robert. I had had one letter from him, sent on from Cadogan Square, and his earnest, "Darling, why haven't you written? Are you all right? Please, please write soon. I'm praying to hear from you," had made me feel guilty. I made up my mind to write that night. It would be easier now that I had something to tell him about my visit to the Bartletts and my new job. That evening, the Muirs went next door for cocktails, and I was able to spend the evening in the warm carpeted lounge. Baby John was wakeful and disturbing Gwendolen, so I put him in the pram beside the fire with me and quietened him occasionally with a peppermint. Sprawled with the sweet bag open alongside me, I composed my letter. I hoped Robert wouldn't notice that my writing was bigger than his own, and that I didn't quite write to the edges of the air letter form. At the bottom I wrote, "Darling, I love you very much." I felt sick and crunched down hard on my peppermint.